On the morning of the 1st of April 1867, large numbers of crowds in the streets of Haussmann's splendid new Paris would have watched the Emperor and the Empress, Napoleon III and his consort, the Empress Eugénie, make their way to the Champ de Mars. The Champ de Mars, for those of us who know Paris, is a large parade ground initially, hence its name, the Field of Mars. Nowadays it's best known because it has the Eiffel Tower at one end by the Seine. Of course, that only came later in 1889. And in 1867, the Champ de Mars was a large open space of about 120 acres. A lot of work had gone into flattening the area because even though it was a parade ground, it wasn't absolutely level. Over the preceding year or two, huge amounts of soil had been transferred, the site had been completely altered, and the very first iron girder went up 1 year to the day before the opening on the 1st of April 1866. When the Emperor and the Empress got there, what they saw, far from being an empty parade ground, was a monumental exhibition site. In the centre of it was an enormous building. They called it the Palace of the Exposition, the Palais de l'Exposition. In fact, it wasn't really a palace in the traditional sense of the word. It was actually a very functional building. It was enormous. It was 1/3 of a mile long. It was 124 feet across, and it contained something like 35,000 tons of iron and glass. So in that sense, it was similar to the Crystal Palace. It was a building which could be put up relatively quickly, taken down, and many parts of it reused. It was vast because the scale of the exhibition was vast. There were over 50,000 exhibitors. In the event, approximately 10 million people visited. So the building was the centre point of the exhibition. But it wasn't the only point, because it was in the centre of the parkland of what was the Champ de Mars. Around it were a very large number of separate pavilions and buildings. About 100 or so extra buildings were there on the site. And then in addition, for agricultural and horticultural exhibitions, there was yet another site, which was 5 miles downriver on the Seine at the island of Billancourt. And this contained another 50 or so acres of exhibition site, which was devoted, as I've said, to agricultural machinery, the latest products, farmhouses, all sorts of things related to agriculture and horticulture. On the opening day, to try and keep numbers limited, the price was a staggering 20 francs, which was a great deal of money, but still 100,000 people paid. For the next week, the price went down to 8 francs, and thereafter, for the remainder of the 6.5 months or so, it was only 3 francs a day. But even 3 francs was about a typical labourer's wage. So in other words, it wasn't for nothing, but then you were getting an awful lot for your money, because once you were in that area, the amount that you could see and enjoy was just unprecedented. And there was, I've already said, I think, about 100 or so different pavilions. Some of these were enormous and included something like a scale model of a Gothic cathedral. Some of them could be quite tiny, like a kiosk where you could have your photograph taken. One of the innovations, of course, of the 1840s and 50s was photography. There were other kiosks where you could have a haircut or buy a lottery ticket. There were rival kiosks between Protestants and Catholics who were trying to get you to have one of their little miniature Bibles. So just about anything and everything was available, from the tiniest kiosk to the largest. And then on top of that, of course, there were the best part of 100 cafes and restaurants servicing the entire area. In terms of profits, the exhibition was successful. The finance of it was interesting because in previous exhibitions, 1851, of course, in London, and 1855 in Paris, they had been largely state-sponsored. This exhibition was a mixture of public and private. And the state and the city of Paris put in relatively small sums of money to kickstart it, but all of the rest was actually financed by private enterprise. The latest figures suggest that about 3 million francs profit was actually made by the exhibition. In much the same way, of course, the Great Exhibition in 1851 also made a profit, which led to the creation of the South Kensington Museums, the V&A and the Science Museum, Natural History and so on. So the profit could go to good causes. I think in terms of the purpose of the exposition, there were many sides to it. Obviously, at the most fundamental level, it was about showcasing France as a modern country and its achievements under Napoleon III and the Second Empire. It was about showcasing Paris and what Baron Haussmann had achieved since he'd been appointed prefect of the Seine in 1853. And so to some extent, this was the culmination of that process. But equally, there were some more interesting side elements to this exhibition. One of the less commented upon nowadays, I think, sides of it is that the emperor was keen to progress the well-being of working people. Now, this was unusual in any ruler in the 19th century. One can't really imagine the King of Prussia or the Tsar being too concerned about these sorts of issues. And yet, one of the exhibits at the exhibition, which was on display in the parkland around the main building, was workers' housing, which had actually been designed by the emperor himself. He already had a track record of interest in this area. As early as the 1840s, he'd written a book called The Extinction of Poverty. And when he was Prince President in the early 1850s, he'd begun his work on designing working-class housing. And this little block of 4 workers' houses, which were on display at the exhibition, were designed to show just what could be achieved in the way of good quality buildings for the ordinary working man. People who had not been to France for a few years were absolutely staggered at the transformation which they saw in Paris. Because, let's face it, in a relatively short space of time, 10 years or so, Paris had been transformed. Medieval Paris, basically. The narrow streets and alleyways were swept away, and the Grand Boulevard, which we see today, were created. So you couldn't help but notice. In addition, any number of new hotels, and very grand hotels were created. New theatres were created. Ring roads were created. And if you were getting there, you were getting there quite possibly on a new railway line. And in fact, this very room that we're talking in is a comment on that, because, of course, the panelling in this room comes from the Château de Bercy, down in the southeast of Paris, which was knocked down for, yes, a railway line. So in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of industry, in terms of agriculture, as I mentioned on the island of Billancourt, France went from being under the empire a net importer to a net exporter of agricultural produce. The amount of railway track increased by 4- or 5-fold. The amount of imports and exports trebled during the empire. These were staggering achievements which no other European economy could match in a mere 20-year period. So I think they had every right to be proud of what they had achieved, and 1867 did seem, in many ways, to be a culmination of that. One of the highlights which we have in the collection here at Chislehurst is this remarkable album. As you can see, it says Souvenir de l'Exposition Universelle de Paris, a souvenir of the exhibition. It's a bound volume in red Morocco with gilt titles, and what happened was that one of the visitors, one of the 10 million or so who visited Paris, was a Belgian nobleman called Baron Félix Zamon. And when he was going around the exhibition, he obviously collected every single leaflet and flyer and bit of information that he could about the exhibits that he was seeing. He then took them with him home to Brussels, engaged a very fine bookbinder, and no doubt told him that he would like the 366 items which are contained in this volume to be displayed to greatest effect. And so what you have inside are a whole series, as I've said, of flyers and leaflets and details about the exhibition. There is just one personal item about the Baron himself, where on one particular day in May 1867, he decided he would have some fun doing some clay pigeon shooting, yet another attraction of the exhibition. And inside is a little receipt where it shows that he had bought 20 shots and he managed to shoot 14 clay pigeons. But amongst the other items, there are all sorts of interesting things which give you an idea of the sheer range and extent of what was on display. So, for instance, on one page, there is a beautiful engraving of a Cavaillé-Coll organ. They were the primary organ makers for churches and cathedrals in 19th century France, still highly valued today. And there's a particular poignancy attached to that because almost exactly 20 years later, in 1887, the Empress was looking at purchasing a Cavaillé-Coll organ for St Michael's Church in Farnborough, where she was creating, of course, the church and the crypt where her husband and her son would be buried and where she herself in her turn would be buried in 1920. And so Farnborough has still, to this day, a functioning Cavaillé-Coll organ. There's only a handful of them in England. And on the opposite page, where the organ is displayed, is to show you the sheer range, are some manure manufacturers from Hackney Wick. So it really does go from the sublime to the almost ridiculous in terms of just one page, but it shows you through those exhibits the sheer range of what a man like Zamont and the 10 million other people who went would be able to see on a day-to-day basis.